Hi, fellow classmates and Dr. Miro. I'm Jessica, one of the presenting members from the Persons with Disabilities group. During the presentation, you will hear from me, Riley, Denise, Miranda, and Sonia. I am going to start with the event that we attended for the participant observer portion of the project requirement, then review the definition of disability, and then move on to how disability impacts all of us, and finally review some historical events. Big City Greens is a show centered around the Green family. The family moves from the country to the big city. The series focuses on Cricket, and he's there in the middle with his arms in the air. And it's about how Cricket adjusts to life in the big city. Tilly is Cricket's sister. Cricket's dad is Bill, he's in the red hat. And then right next to Bill is Cricket's grandma. In the Quiet Please episode, the show's creators incorporated American Sign Language and gestures to allow the characters to communicate because they visited the library and a strict librarian threatened to throw them out if they made any sounds. Respectability hosted this virtual event to talk with the show creators about their process in creating a show and the steps they took to ensure authentic deaf representation. Respectability is an organization that fights stigmas and advances opportunities so people with disabilities can fully participate in all aspects of the community. I am going to play a small clip of the episode.
Hey, I've been meaning to ask, can we get a puppy? We can't talk, but we can use sign language. Wait, y'all don't know sign language?
Hello. I love, you. Sorry, me not know much.
That's okay. You three can just do charades. Charades.
Good brain, Cricket. We find Cricket book.
Let my favorite fantasy books carry you away to another world. Murder mysteries.
Tatiana from Respectability hosted the event. The creators of Big City Greens discussed their inspiration for the episode, and they said they wanted to pay homage to the movie A Quiet Place, so they figured they could do the same thing by having the Big City Greens characters visit a library. The creators are Shane and Chris, and they are brothers. They asked Disney for ASL consultants, and Disney agreed. Right below Chris and Shane, that's Delbert. He's a deaf filmmaker and a Respectability Board member. Jevin is a deaf filmmaker and ASL dialogue coach. Delbert and Jevin, they're also brothers. So how did Shane and Chris communicate with Delbert and Jevin? Well, they were able to communicate with the assistance of Justin. Justin is an ASL interpreter who is a child of deaf adults. The creators have used consultants in the past, but they never really get to meet the consultants. For the Quiet Please episode, Chris and Shane were able to work directly with Delbert and Jevin in person, and this was pre-COVID. ASL is a very visual language, so they needed to be able to communicate in person. Delbert and Jevin were filmed signing the lines at full speed and half speed. They focused on timing and how the hands and face moved. Delbert and Jevin made a point to acknowledge that there are different types of deaf people in the world. Some may have a broken arm, have a physical limitation, or maybe they're carrying a baby at the time that they're trying to communicate. So Delbert and Jevin wanted to include gestures in the episode because deaf people are fluent in gestures because that's how they communicate with people who don't know sign language. The show's target audience is children, so they were all very purposeful in keeping this in mind and also keeping the signs simple and extremely clear. I really could go on about the event. I learned so much, and it was extremely informative and educational. The term disability refers to a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or having a record of such an impairment, or being regarded as having an impairment. The ADA does an excellent job of further breaking down the definition. So let's go back to the first bullet point and talk about major life activities. The ADA classifies major life activities in two ways. The first is general. General life activities cover, but they're certainly not limited to, caring for oneself, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, speaking, breathing, learning, thinking, communicating, and working. The second major life activities classification has to do with major bodily functions. This includes, but again, is not limited to, functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, neurological, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. Moving to the third bullet point, regarded as having such an impairment. The ADA recognizes individuals who perceive themselves as having a disability. These individuals would fall under this category. Not only will the ADA cover an actual physical or mental impairment, but they will cover a perceived physical or mental impairment as well. The ADA's intent was to ensure the definition was broad so that as many individuals as possible could be included. According to the World Health Organization, disability has three dimensions: impairment, activity limitation, and participation restrictions. In the ICF, they discuss how complex disability is. The reason it is a complicated phenomenon is that it is a problem at the level of a person's body and a complex and primarily social phenomena. There are two major conceptual models of disability. One is the medical model. The medical model views disability as a feature of the person directly caused by disease, trauma, or another health condition. The social model sees disability as a socially created problem and not at all an attribute of an individual. In the social model, disability demands a political response since the problem is created by an unaccommodating physical environment brought about by attitudes and other features of the social environment. According to the ICF, a more useful model would be one that integrates the medical and social models. The ICF prefers a biopsychosocial model because it is important to acknowledge an individual's health conditions, environmental factors, and internal personal factors. Again, disability involves dysfunctioning at one or more of these same levels: impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. 61 million adults in the United States live with a disability. Really, that translates to 1 in 4 adults in the US have some type of disability. Texas percent of adults living with disability is right in line with the national percentage. I looked at the state of Louisiana, and it has 32.3% of adults with some type of disability. For comparison, Washington State has 23.5%, and New York has 22.2% of adults with some type of disability. Despite progress, adults with disability in Texas and across the country continue to experience significant differences in health characteristics. The table shows 4 high-risk categories. We can see the comparison between the US and Texas. However, the comparison within each of the high-risk categories is more important because we can see the disparity between adults with disabilities versus adults without disabilities. Looking at the percentages of a person with disabilities in Texas has a higher potential to be within 3 of the 4 high-risk categories compared to other Americans and other Americans with disabilities. Now that we have reviewed the definition of disability and how disability impacts us, we'll move on to historical events. The disability history timeline does not capture every significant event, but we wanted to highlight some of the important events. We'll be moving from left to right on the slides. In the Revolutionary War, An estimated 25,000 American service personnel died during the war, and it is estimated that perhaps as many as another 25,000 were wounded and survived. In recognition of the hardships endured by Revolutionary soldiers, Congress enacted a series of national pension laws for veterans after the war. A veteran was considered disabled if he was either fully or partially incapable of laboring for a living. In the 1800s, Philippe Pinel developed a four-part medical classification for major mental illnesses. Pinel believed in humane methods to treat those who were mentally ill, and he is considered the founder of psychiatry in France. In 1817, Thomas H. Gallaudet founded the American School for the Deaf. What began Thomas's journey was when he noticed that his younger siblings were not playing with another child. When he went out to investigate, he learned that this young woman, Alice, was deaf. Not knowing sign language, Thomas attempted to communicate with Alice by pointing to his hat and writing H-A-T in the dirt. She understood him, and he was inspired to teach her more. Her father, Mason Cogswell, a wealthy doctor, financed Thomas's trip to Europe, since there were no schools for deaf children in the United States at that time. In 1844, the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane was founded. The association eventually became the American Psychiatric Association. Eugenics is the belief in the possibility of improving the qualities of the human species, especially by means as discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or presumed to have inheritable undesirable traits, or encouraging reproduction by persons presumed to have inheritable desirable traits. Indiana enacted the first eugenic sterilization law in 1907. The law made sterilization mandatory for criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles in state custody. On October 31st, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed into law the Community Mental Health Act, which drastically altered the delivery of mental health services and inspired a new era of optimism in mental health care. This law led to the establishment of comprehensive community mental health centers throughout the country. The Americans with Disabilities Act is signed into law by George H.W. Bush. It is designed to meet four goals for people with disabilities: equal opportunity, full participation in the community, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Recognizing persisting health and healthcare disparities, lawmakers inserted provisions related to disability into the Affordable Care Act. Section 4302 calls for the establishment of standards for accessible medical diagnostic equipment and calls for gathering systematic and consistent data on populations affected by health disparities, including people with disabilities. Section 5307 authorizes federal funding for training healthcare professionals in competencies related to disability culture.
Hi everybody, my name is Riley, and today I'm going to be talking about what it looks like to just be a part of this population. First, before we dive into everything, I just want to touch on the importance of a language and how it's really important to touch on this when you're learning about this population. So describing a person with a disability, it's really important to use person-first language. So instead of maybe describing somebody as a blind man or a deaf woman, you would say a person with visual impairment, or a person who is blind, or a woman who is deaf. So really identifying them first as just a person and then their disability. Because when you use that kind of reverse language of saying a disabled woman, it really makes a lot of their identity about their disability, and that can come with a lot of inherent negatives, like people assuming that they are weak or suffering, or that there is a tragedy. So it's really important to kind of switch that around. Some other points about language is just the phrase and vocabulary and use of the word normalization. So there's this prevailing idea that people with a disability can really only achieve happiness when they are working towards being normal and assimilating into normal society. So that kind of touches on this idea that there's an opportunity to function in a normal society by assimilating and really capitalizing on the strengths and skills that they might have in order for them to kind of be an object of labor and functionality. So it really just leads to this further degree of separation that is just kind of unhelpful. So yeah, that's just another important thing to think about when you're discussing and learning about this community. So jumping right into it, disability kind of looks different across culture, as most things do. So for instance, in Japan and Uganda, physical disabilities were believed to have an aura contamination. And this aura goes beyond just that person and can even affect those within the family and members of the community. And this kind of can lead to a lot of separation, a lot of outcast, and really leaves that person just vulnerable and having to fend for themselves because there is this kind of negative connotation with disability. But in other cultures, like for instance in South Korea, deviations in the body can actually induce a higher status or even just a regular like neutral status in comparison to able-bodied individuals. So therefore there's not really any stigmatization. And not many people were marginalized because of their disability. Research conducted by Frank Brunn on the disabled person in Nicaragua showed how disabled war veterans were actually given a positive identity for their heroic efforts in serving in their country. So again, you can kind of see the pretty big difference between what disability looks like across culture. It's very unique depending on where someone might be from. So another important topic for this community is representation. So within the media, there's really not a lot of representation, and if there is representation, it often is kind of negative, and they're portrayed as, weak. They're portrayed as a burden and just really, again, negative connotations. This graph right here kind of is a statistical layout of the disabilities that are currently represented in media. So 2.4 of all speaking characters were depicted with a disability, so you can see how that's extremely low. And from that 2.4, 61 was physical, 37 was mental, and 18 was communicative. And 81% was male, and 19% was female. So you can see that that is not a lot of representation at all. So continuing that, the media can play a really, really big important role for this community, because if the media is representing this community with negative stereotypes and promoting just the wrong idea, then a lot of people in this community are going to feel the weight of that. People who maybe don't have a lot of experience with persons with disabilities in real life are going to see this representation and maybe further lean into the stereotypes and ideas that are being portrayed. This quote says, "Disability is the largest minority group in America and is the only minority group that people can join at any time due to accident, illness, or aging. The disability community includes people of all genders, races, ethnicities, LGBTQ status, and economic status, and should be represented in film and such." So as you can see, I really like the fact that this points out that this is not something that this isn't a community that excludes anybody. This is something that anybody can join, anyone can be a part of. So it's really important to have that representation. So what does sexuality and disability look like? The social construct of the impaired body is viewed as passive and dependent, which leads to a lot of desexualization, representing people with disability as inadequate to a full, intimate life. So this is also a part of representation in the media, and that there isn't really a lot of relationships that are portrayed for disabled bodies in the media. disabled bodies are not seen as sexual, nor do they align with mainstream understandings of desirability, and therefore they don't have any erotic capital. And because they don't have any erotic capital, again, there's not really any portrayal in the media because there's a lot of erotic capital that needs to be had in the media. So again, if their bodies aren't portrayed that way, there's really not any representation. According to a 2018 study, narrow heteronormative and ableist understandings of sexual intercourse and the characters in mainstream stories of intimacy are shown as hindering the prospects of the recognition of disabled women as sexual citizens. So as you saw on the last slide, there is, even when there is representation, it is predominantly male or male presenting, and so disabled women have very little to go off of when they are beginning to understand themselves as sexual citizens. So all of that being said, how do we overcome this stigma? How do we work on having a conversation about this? So over the years, especially with the rise of social media, there's been a lot of spaces that have been created for all bodies, no matter what their ability may be, and it's becoming more of an inclusive space for all bodies. Being exposed to more bodies that are disabled on public platforms and not shielding them away or hiding them away or keeping them out of public eye is at the foundation of how we can alter misconceptions about sexuality in disabled bodies. It's a really good way for just the mainstream culture to understand that, you know, this exists. These people are sexual beings and they deserve to be viewed as such. And again, it's really just important for people who do understand this or who are just even trying to understand this to have conversations with people about sexuality, ability, and orientation, and the fact that they are not binary. It's really complicated and complex, and it's really worth talking about, and that's kind of how we work towards overcoming this. So another part about being a part of this community is exploitation and abuse. So this specifically aligns with, often aligns with people who have intellectual disabilities or invisible disabilities that people begin to take advantage of them across the internet platform is a really big problem right now. So financial fraud is among the fastest growing types of abuse for individuals in this community. And individuals with intellectual disabilities are particularly vulnerable. They can be exploited by someone known to the victim, but many cases are, again, happening through social media and over the phone and stuff like that. A lot of like phishing and a lot of, you know, love interests that are lying to take advantage of these individuals. Abusers realize that targeting this audience and targeting this community means that they are probably less likely to be reported, and individuals with special needs are often overly trusting and may not realize that they're being victimized. So again, leads to lack of reporting, more likely to get away with it, stuff like that. So diving into legislation, Jessica kind of talked on it when she was going over the history of everything. But legislation determines the existence and recognition of the disability by defining what it means to be disabled, that establishes the criteria and determines just all of the kind of intricacies to having a disability. Legislation also determines the establishment of medical and paramedical institutions as well as educational services. So you can see just how important it is to have this legislation. I apologize for the barking. There are 6 dogs in my house right now, so it's kind of chaotic. So again, after not being included in the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, was created in 1990. So you can see just how long it took for them to be included in this legislation, which again is extremely important because of the need for definition and criteria. Other issues with rights have included many court cases on their accessibility are refused to be heard, and most legislation is narrow and full of loopholes for interpretation. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to get away with abuse and lack of representation and lack of access, stuff like that. So diving more into the ADA, the ADA was a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of this law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same opportunities and rights as people with able bodies. Title I guarantees equality and equal employment opportunities for this community. So again, this was not implemented until 1990, so you can see just how left out they were in the beginning and just how important this is and how much growth has come out of this movement and how much growth there still needs to be. So for our interview, we went ahead and interviewed Jenna Curry at 29 Acres. This is actually where I work, and I am directly underneath Jenna and get to work alongside her. So 29 Acres is a living community for adults with autism. There are two programs. There is the Enrich program and the Transition Academy, and Jenna runs the Transition Academy. So the Enrich program is more for individuals with autism who are on the lower functioning end, those who are nonverbal and need a little bit more assistance just with daily life. They live at the community and work with life skills coaches and vocational specialists and all kinds of really amazing people that work to enrich their life. The Transition Academy is where Jenna runs and where I work. Jenna is a 10-year veteran special education teacher who is driven to help students to overcome barriers that impact their learning. Before she was the director, she kind of taught classes with these individuals and really worked to, again, help them overcome a lot of barriers. So I talked to Jenna a lot about what this community needs and what it looks like to move forward with those needs and kind of what it looks like for people who want to advocate and help this community out. So, needs of the community are advocacy for representation for neurodiversity, kind of what we touched on earlier, of just we need voices. We need people who are going to listen, who are going to talk about it, who are going to have those conversations. We need to welcome persons with disabilities, especially in the education system, with less restrictive environments. So this might look like having, in a lot of schools right now, there's a lot of separation between neurotypical students and neurodiverse students, and so this would maybe look like including a more inclusive environment, mixing that up, meeting needs in the same classroom to really encourage neurodiversity. Another really good need for the community and really prominent need is connection to meaningful employment and opportunities to socialize with peers. So this is something that she talked a lot about. And barriers in this community and barriers to those things are super prominent. She shared some statistics with me, telling me about how 90% of adults with ASD are unemployed or underemployed, and 87% of adults live with their parents, but only 22% actually even want to be there. So they most often live with parents who are ill-equipped to meet their ongoing needs as parents advance in age. So as adults age, parents obviously age, and needs are less likely to be met as that time goes on. So she talked about how does change occur. So she said, improving access to people, places, and jobs and activities to improve self-esteem and sustain a higher quality of life. This is a lot of what 29 Acres does. The main goal of this community is not for them to live there forever. It's to help them grow and encourage their self-esteem and to identify their strengths and promote development and promote independence and help them move into a place in their life where they can live on their own, where those 87% of adults who don't want to be with their parents can be separate and live separately from their parents. So this looks like promoting fulfillment, greater independence and productivity, teaching health and safety, communicating engagement and interpersonal relationships, and you do all those things through advocacy, representation, community, and funding. And 29 Acres is a really good resource just for people that want to learn and want to get involved and who want to advocate and who want to help that representation community because there are needs that need to be met. And so if you're drawn towards that, this would be a really good place to get started. Jen is amazing, and I'm really lucky to have interviewed her and just to be able to work alongside her. So some of that information would be the misinformation on vaccines and autism. So vaccines cause autism paints autism as some kind of devastating curse to an individual and society, or as the most serious trauma a parent could endure. This statement stands as an obstacle to an embracement of neurodiversity, and this misinformation has a devastating effect on autistic people who now have to bear the stigma of allegedly being vaccine injured on top of having autism in a neurotypical world. So this movement has been extremely harmful to the community because, again, it just places an even larger burden on parents who parents who have children with a disability and with autism, and it places a further burden on the individual who does have autism and further creates an us versus them society. It creates more barriers, it creates more separation, and it's just really not helpful. More barriers to employment. Physical barriers can take the form of structural issues in the environment that include that impede functioning. For example, the lack of a wheelchair ramp or an elevator, or not improving or modifying equipment, and so they're unable to perform or even attend a job, because how can they get to a job if they can't get up the stairs or they can't perform a task? That's a pretty big barrier. Barriers in communication. Communication obstacles create an inability for an effective way to communicate, such as speaking, writing, reading, etc. Inability to use a phone due to a hearing issue, lack of braille printed items for blind persons, and language that is too technical for someone with a cognitive impairment to fully be able to process. There's also a lack of accommodation. In 2006, 56 respondents provided strong evidence that perceptions of disability have a great impact on their inability to maintain and secure employment, that does the lack of accommodative practices and measures of a workplace. So you can see how that could be really harmful for somebody in this community. And one that kind of overarchingly affects all areas of this is stereotypes and attitudes that go all the way back to what we're talking about with representation. Judgments and assumptions about disabled persons can prevent them from even getting hired. While the ADA is in place and it is illegal to discriminate, these attitudes still prevail. They're still there, there's still prejudice, there's still stigma, and there's still discrimination despite those acts being in place. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the cultural identity model. I hope that you were able to kind of gather some really solid information about what it looks like to be a part of this community and what you can take away and learn from this. I think it's a really cool way to engage, and it's a really cool thing that we're doing by learning about all this. So they're going to go ahead. I believe Miranda is up next. So enjoy.
Hi, everybody. Now we're going to be talking about disability rights activists, current events, issues, and local disability organizations that do a lot within our community in DFW. So this is a list of disability rights activists from the past and from the present who are still active today. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the folks who have done a lot of work and have been recognized by multiple organizations and online. Essentially, all the folks from the past were crucial in the creation of and passing of the ADA. So first is Ed Roberts, who is known as the father of the independent living movement. He was initially denied high school graduation and college admission because of his disability. In fact, the college admissions board said, "We tried cripples and it didn't work." But he continued to advocate for himself and was allowed to do both, and went on to obtain many degrees. Many of his protests and activism during his time in school paved the way for the passing of the ADA. Evan Camp Jr. was the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the late 80s and early 90s. He was an advocate for ending discrimination in the workplace against disabled persons. In his role at the EEOC, he did a lot of work to make sure disabled persons could not only obtain employment, but be treated fairly in order to become self-sufficient. Fred Fay was the co-founder of the Boston Center for Independent Living, the Massachusetts Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, and of the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. He was also awarded the Henry B. Betts Award for Outstanding Achievement in Civil Rights for Americans with Disabilities, and his flat-out advocacy over several decades, including his role in the development of Justice for All, which was instrumental in the implementation of the ADA in 1990. Justin Dart Jr. helped to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. He also co-founded the American Association of People with Disabilities and is regarded as the godfather of the ADA. He and family members went on tours of the United States to meet with and talk to activists and people with disabilities. And based on the conversations they had, this helped to develop the ADA. Wade Blank started ADAPT, the American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today program. It's a grassroots disability rights organization that now has chapters in 30 states. It was started in Denver, Colorado in 1975 when Reverend Blank, who was a non-disabled former nursing home director, assisted several of the severely disabled residents to move out and start their own community. ADAPT also now practices legislative policy advocacy, grassroots education and mobilization, and individual members may engage in legal advocacy. Now, for activists who are still doing a lot of work today, Judy Heumann is recognized internationally as a leader in the disability community and has helped move the independent living movement outside of the United States. She has worked as a disability rights activist since Ed Roberts was on the scene. She founded Disabled in Action, an organization that focused on securing the protection of people with disabilities under civil rights laws through political protest. She helped develop the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She served in the Clinton and Obama administrations in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services and as a special advisor on the international disability rights of the US State Department. She was the first to hold this role and served from 2010 to 2017 within Obama's administration. She also recently published a book, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist, which was published in February of this year. Alice Wong is the founder of the Disability Visibility Project, which I'll talk a little bit about in another slide. She also created the Disabled Writers Project, which is a resource to help editors connect with disabled writers and journalists. Hashtag CripLit is a series of Twitter chats for disabled writers with the novelist Nicola Griffith, and hashtag CripTheVote, a nonpartisan online movement encouraging the political participation of disabled people. Alice is a huge part of these hashtags. She was a presidential appointee to the National Council on Disability, an independent federal agency which advises the president, Congress, and other federal agencies on disability policies, programs, and practices. Anita Cameron is a member of ADAPT, advocating and protesting for disability and LGBTQ+ rights. Currently, Anita is the director of minority outreach at Not Dead Yet, a national disability rights organization that fights against physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia of people with disabilities. Dominic Evans is a non-binary, transgender queer, Polish-American filmmaker, activist, Twitch streamer, public speaker, writer, and former activist for disabled people and the LGBTQ+ community. In 2014, he started the Twitter discussion #FilmDis, a now monthly discussion that explores the problems with inclusion of those with disabilities, as well as portrayals of disability in film, television, and other media. He previously worked at the Center for Disability Rights in New York as a media and entertainment advocate. He currently does streaming on Twitch and film consultation work, having consulted on shows from major networks like Netflix. This is something that's particularly relevant in today's world, especially in the last few weeks, as the musical artist Sia released a movie called Music, which focuses on an autistic teenager's coming of age and cast a non-autistic person to play this role. Someone like Dominic Evans could have really been instrumental in helping them create a more authentic experience based on the life of someone with autism and help them find a disabled actor to play this role. King's Floyd gave a TED Talk on society's failure to implement accessible design, which I've provided the link for in the PowerPoint. She currently writes blogs and freelances about the reality of living with a disability in today's society that is not made to be accessible to persons who are disabled. She is also active politically in protests and other disability rights movements and organizations. She acts as a speaker and consultant on disability rights issues and access barriers. One local organization that really is displaying the capability of persons with disabilities is North Texas Performing Arts Starcatchers. And if you'd like to read more information, I've provided the link in the PowerPoint. Starcatchers is a program for children and adults with special needs who are given the opportunity to do various artistic endeavors: drama, music, dance, visual art. One thing that I'm particularly familiar with is their musical theater area, where we have music therapists on staff that help these students learn music and choreography to perform musicals for the community. Some of their performances include Mary Poppins Jr., Mamma Mia, Matilda, among others, as well as an original musical created by NTPA staff. These are some current disability rights events and issues. In Texas, we have something called the Community Living Assistance and Support Services, the Class Waiver, which provides in-home and community-based services for individuals with an intellectual disability or related condition. For example, as a music therapist, I currently see individuals with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and even autism as part of the Class Waiver. But one of the biggest problems with the Class Waiver is that there are over 140,000 people on a waiting list as long as 10 years. And most people are willing to wait it out at this time because their only other option is a state-supported living facility, which in Texas are historically known for not great conditions. This is also due to cuts in Medicaid. There are constantly threats of reduced funding and actual reduced funding in this area. Another problem with Medicaid is that eligibility differs from state to state. So if your eligibility in Oregon is good, you may move to Texas and not have that same eligibility. And in Texas, they have not expanded Medicaid under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. So there is a lot of federal funding that Texas does not get because they have not expanded Medicaid in this way. Lately, there's been a lot of self-advocacy on the part of disabled persons, like the Disability Visibility movement, which aims to cultivate an online community dedicated to creating, sharing, and amplifying disability media and culture. Apple recently released an article about how individuals with disabilities are now sharing their voices more than ever because technology has come a long way since the creation of the ADA. This article, meant to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ADA, interviews several different people on how they have utilized technology to get their voices heard. We have jazz musicians like Matthew Whitaker who are utilizing different Apple apps and softwares to create his music and post it out in the world. There are people like Tatiana Lee, an actress, model, Hollywood inclusion activist, and business owner who utilizes voice over apps and other software using technological devices as she uses her hands for everything. So she utilizes this technology to communicate. There's also people like Dean Hudson, who is an accessibility technical evangelist at Apple. He assisted Apple in creating the voiceover for iPhone and other parts of the software that integrated voice technology. Another thing disability rights activists have been fighting misinformation, utilizing their activism, technology, and collectives, etc., to educate and inform the public about the reality of disability and combat ableism. So in looking at a relevant cultural identity model, This was something that I researched to try and find a definition or idea that was very cohesive in nature and sort of applied to all groups across the disability span. But as you can probably guess, that was nearly impossible. But in my research, I ran across this definition and I thought it was very encompassing of the disability experience. People with disabilities have forged a group identity. We share a common history of oppression and common bond of resilience. We generate art, music, literature, and other expressions of our lives, our culture, infused from our experiences of disability. Most importantly, we are proud of ourselves as people with disabilities. We claim our disabilities with pride as part of our identity. We are who we are. We are people with disabilities. So keeping that in mind, what kind of cultural identity models are there for disabilities? There are a lot. There are different ideas on which ones are the most prominent or the most relevant, but these are the ones that we're going to be looking at today. Moral, religious, medical, social, identity, human rights, cultural, charity, economic, and limits. The moral or religious model is the oldest model of disability culture. It views disability as a punishment for sin, or disability as a special test of faith, or disability is a blessing and opportunity for personal development. When you think about this model, consider the portrayal of people who were disabled within the Bible as burdens to society and who only had something to offer once they were healed by Jesus. This is generally no longer applied in society, but still has had a lasting impact in the way that we view people with disabilities. Some cultures do maintain this viewpoint if their views on health are rooted in spiritual practices. So it's important to keep this in mind when treating people with disabilities who may have these spiritual beliefs or who have family members that have these kinds of spiritual beliefs. The medical model is something that we are probably more familiar with. It was a follow-up to the moral or religious model and views disability as a medical issue or defect. And so, if you're born disabled, it's a tragedy and viewed as very bad or negative, or even if you have a disability that is developed later in life due to trauma or illness. Ableist language dominates this view. It's where language like invalid, crippled, spastic, retarded, etc. became really commonplace. Physicians view disability in this model as a problem that needs to be solved. They want to fix what's wrong with you. So they take on the role of healer to treat the sickness of disability. And the same could be said of caregivers of people with disabilities. It's something that needs to be fixed and rectified, not something that is just part of their existence. The social model was developed as a reaction to the medical model and views disability as a socially constructed phenomenon, which says that disability is something that was created by society. Disability solutions should be rooted in societal change, they say, not changes made by the individual, which means that they believe society needs to adjust their viewpoint on disability rather than people with disability trying to change themselves for society. They advocate for changing language to better and more accurately encapsulate disabled life. The social model has played a big role in the disability rights movement and how we view disability today. The identity model shares a lot of traits with the social model, but a big difference is the view of disability as a positive identity. Disability is a group of insiders rather than outsiders, meaning that within themselves, the disability community is a group and they're not outside of the quote unquote norm. There's a big affirmation of disability pride and positive self-image. And their main goal is to create positive definitions of disability identity based on the experiences and circumstances that have resulted in the creation of this minority group. The human rights model believes that disability is a human rights issue and emphasizes the human dignity of disabled persons. It also respects the unique struggles faced by disabled persons and really places an emphasis on identity politics. It also offers constructive, useful proposals and suggestions for improving the life situations of disabled persons. The cultural model focuses on the various cultural factors that influence disability and the way we view disability. It does not seek to define disability in any specific way. it asks the question, how do different ideas of disability and non-disability present themselves in specific cultural contexts? So, how do different groups of people within society view disability and non-disability? How do white folks view disability and non-disability? How do Black folks view disability and non-disability? How do people in other countries outside the United States view disability and non-disability? How do people that are rooted in religious and spiritual practices view disability and non-disability? What does that look like? And how does that affect how that community and the rest of the community view disability? It also wonders the cultural locations of persons with disabilities and how has that affected how they are viewed within society and has validated the medical model. For example, persons with disabilities in institutions has really taught a lot of society to be fearful of people with disabilities, thinking that they're unstable and cannot help themselves. And this is simply not true. So the cultural model aims to correct this mistake, which meaning pathologizing and isolating people with disabilities so that we can create a more authentic understanding of disability cultures actually within society rather than without it. The charity model. This is a model that I think that I actually grew up from, a model that I sort of have learned in the last few years is not great, and something that I think a lot of society kind of latches onto. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not an accurate representation of how we should view or treat persons with disabilities. Within the charity model, disabled persons are victims of circumstance that should be pitied. So kind of similar to the medical model in that it's kind of a bad thing to be disabled. But in contrast to the medical model, able-bodied people should do everything they can to help these people. Anything that disabled people need, able-bodied people should be doing for them or helping them figure out. And it really encourages humane treatment of people with disabilities. So as opposed to the medical model where they're kind of viewed as, maybe a burden or something's wrong with them, so we need to treat them as such, this encourages humane treatment of these people. So it seems really good on the surface, but in the disability community, it's generally viewed as negative because it perpetuates the idea that all disabled persons are incompetent, codependent, helpless, and things like that. The economic model is really focused on the various disabling effects of an impairment on a person's capabilities, especially when it comes to things like work and employment. Unsurprisingly, this is the model that is often used by governments to determine and guide disability policy. And it's really focused on the quote unquote advancement of people with a disability within workspaces. So like securing a job, developing a career, and things like that. But in reality, it really tends to view people with disabilities from a more clinical standpoint, from a cost-benefit analysis POV. So how is a disabled person contributing to the economy? And if they're not, do they really have any value? The limits model accepts that all people experience some kind of limitations, and these limitations change and vary throughout our lives. Limitness, as they say, is not a negative quality or an inability, but another different kind of embodiment of the human experience. Some people want to overcome their limits, but no one has or needs to. For example, I wear glasses, and some people wear contacts. Some people have LASIK surgery to eliminate their vision issues, but they don't have to. I'm more comfortable wearing glasses. Some people that are part of the deaf community, they get cochlear implants or they have surgery to correct their hearing loss. But some people are fine being part of the deaf with a capital D community and having hearing loss. So what the limits model says is that in these limits that we have, we are all connected, regardless of our ability or inability in these areas. It also says that people who have the different limits maybe are more connected than people within a disabled community would be. For example, back to the glasses analogy, me wearing glasses, I may have something more in common with someone who has a vision impairment than someone with a vision impairment may have with someone with another disability. The limits model casts off the idea of normal and disabled and instead embraces the interconnectedness of related experiences within all of our limits. So as you can see, all of these identity models have pros and cons. Each one can be viewed as the truth or the right model depending on the cultural context and the person's background. So this is why it's important to be aware of all these different models when working with a disabled client or family members of disabled clients. And the way that each party may view disability could be different. So it's important to keep these things in mind so that you can provide effective treatment and care. In a 2018 study, Pratt discovered the most important values in creating a disability culture were independence, social justice, and giving back to others, as well as community support, meaning the formation of some kind of disability community.
Hi, my name is Denise, and I am covering potential counseling issues. So first, I'm going to start off with the American Disability Act, specifically Title III, which is public accommodations. Public accommodations, Title III Act states that businesses must comply with any basic non-discrimination requirements that prohibit exclusion, segregation, and unequal treatment. They being businesses, must also comply with specific requirements related to architectural standards for new and altered buildings, reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures, effective communication with people that have hearing, vision, or speech disabilities, and other access requirements. Additionally, public accommodations must remove barriers in existing buildings where it is easy to do so without much difficulty or expense, given the public accommodation resources. And Title III covers any businesses that are public and privately owned, as well as any nonprofit service providers. And the reason that I'm including the Title III Act and starting with it is because I feel like this is kind of a foundation to treating all clients equally, and the Title III Act, I think, kind of bleeds into all part of our everyday life, and any clients that do have disabilities, you're going to definitely want to make sure that you are, complying with this and helping them out in the best way that you can. Next up, we're going to move on to biases against persons with disabilities. So it is important to continuously build awareness of any biases that we might form against individuals that have disabilities. And these biases normally form unintentionally and over time, or there sometimes might be just a single instance where you do form biases, and these can either be positive or negative, and these can cause problems in counseling because suddenly you're potentially limiting a client in what they can or cannot do because of these biases. Therefore, they're not going to be gaining all of the help that they could be getting out from you. Next, we are counseling people that have physical disabilities. When counseling people with physical disabilities, we need to be sure to accommodate any physical barriers that they might encounter. A great potential issue when counseling people with physical disabilities are environmental barriers. These can include anything such as like a random step to get into your building, any boxes that you have in the hallway. And to avoid these environmental barriers, you can take the following steps to help ensure that they have easy access. The first one is just being wheelchair accessible. Make sure that there is a ramp or an elevator available anywhere where there are stairs. And make sure that the hallway is wide enough for a wheelchair to be able to pass through it easily. Keep any physical barriers out of the hallway. Again, like I mentioned, any boxes in the way, those could just cause a blockage for them. And then lastly is making sure that your doorways are wide enough for a wheelchair to fit through there, because I think pretty obviously if a client isn't able to reach into your office, you're not going to be able to counsel them. And then another physical disability is counseling people with visual impairments. So when counseling people with visual impairments, be prepared to make some alterations to how you would normally run a session. So you would need to take account into any ethical concerns if a client does not have access to the regular documents that you would give a client during your intake. This can include like a HIPAA notice and confidentiality notice, among other things. Also consider how facial expressions and body language is going to be limited during your counseling session. So if you're like me, I talk a lot with my hands, and I feel like my eyebrows are very expressive sometimes. So instead, try focusing more on the tone of your voice and just being a lot clearer with what you're trying to say. This can just help remove any confusion during your counseling sessions. And during your intake, be prepared to accept other forms of identification, because keep in mind, most people that have severe visual impairments do not have a driver's license. So just for legal reasons, be prepared to accept maybe just instead like an ID or a passport. Also be prepared to accommodate any service animals. I would read up on like the rules of how to handle those. And during your intake, instead of handing your client just a packet of any documents you have, I would take the extra time to read those legal documents, just to kind of help them really understand what they're getting into and all of the rules that you have. Another thing is to have Braille on all of the doors, and if a client is new to your building, you might also need to be prepared to assist them to other rooms, such as a bathroom, just because if they're new to a space, they'll need help getting around, so just be prepared to do that as well. Next we have people that have hearing impairments. So similarly with people that have visual impairments, you may also face some communication barriers. I know a lot of time people that use hearing aids, the tone of your voice can be lost. It sounds a little bit more robotic. And so just like people that have visual impairments, try to be clear with what you're saying and with any implications that you might have. If you're able to, I would definitely consider hiring an interpreter so the client can gain the maximum help during a session. I know interpreters have different types of languages for whatever their tone of your voice is. So if you're being goofy, they'll just try and interpret it in a goofy manner, versus if you're being a little more serious, then they'll interpret whatever you're saying in a serious manner. And during COVID times, we're all wearing a mask, so I would consider buying a clear mask so clients are still able to read your lips whenever you're talking to them. And if you have a new client, or even an old one, I would definitely be prepared to trade in notes with them. And this is also just another way that people communicate. Let's see. Now, when counseling people with invisible disabilities, I think the biggest thing here is to stay open-minded. So right here I have just a few examples of invisible disabilities. This can include some ones that could cause major problems for us, such as dyslexia and ADHD. So just be considerate of clients that have invisible disabilities. So whenever you're assigning a client, let's say like journaling homework or reading homework, I would try maybe offering different alterations for that, just because they might struggle a lot to get that done. So when a client is reporting that they have an invisible disability and maybe they're making a special request for different homework, take that consideration in with an open heart and with an open mind. And similar to what I was just talking about, counseling people with learning disabilities. You definitely might have to take an alternative approach when counseling people with learning disabilities. Clients with learning disabilities may be easily distracted. So as an alternative, you can do something that is a little more interactive to help them stay focused. And let's say a client is autistic, they may not understand your sarcasm and they may take whatever you're saying very literally. So just keep in mind that you might have to change some things. Your clients overall just may need a little bit more assistance when it comes to breaking down your assessments and your homework. And for your intake documents, just like all of your other clients, you might need to take some extra time out when you're explaining those, and you might need to actually read it to them. Let's see. And I would maybe consider getting training in either children or adolescents counseling if you haven't, and this just may help you kind of get some alternative methods of how to counsel people that have learning disabilities. Overall, it just kind of helps them gain everything that they can from you. Alright, and that is everything I have for you guys.
Hello everyone, my name is Sonia Fox, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes discussing some of the ethical issues to consider when counseling individuals with disabilities. I don't know if your experiences have been similar to mine throughout the semester as we've looked at each topic and really dove into it, but when I start looking at each one of these issues that I need to educate myself on, it seems like this issue opens up the door to another issue that I need to educate myself on, and then that issue leads me to another issue, and there is just a wealth of information out there. And so I'm thankful for the opportunity that we have to continually educate ourselves and become better for every client population that we serve. But then obviously for that reason, because there are so many opportunities to educate ourselves, I won't be able to address every single issue that may come up when counseling individuals with disabilities. But I tried to look at the overall process and address some of the most common. These are ones that I feel like we each have an obligation to uphold in our careers, and that we will at some point come in contact with or have to put into practice these ethical obligations throughout our career. But before we break those down and really look at some specific issues that affect this population, I thought it was really important to cover some of our core professional values and the principles found in the Code of Ethics. The preamble of the Code of Ethics calls us each to live out our ethical commitment by following some core professional values. These values include enhancing human development throughout the lifespan, honoring diversity, and embracing a multicultural approach in support of the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of people within their social and cultural context, promote social justice, safeguard the integrity of the counselor-client relationship, and practice in a competent and ethical manner. Obviously, because they're listed in the Code of Ethics, they apply to every client that we counsel. But I personally believe that it's even more prevalent when we're called to stand in the gap and advocate for someone who may not have the capacity to advocate for themselves. As we talked a little bit earlier in the presentation, this particular group has been targeted for exploitation and fraud over and over again. The people that target them, they do it because it's less likely that these crimes will be reported. And the reason that it's less likely is these individuals with disabilities are often very trusting, and because of that, they're victimized more times than not. So this places on the counselor an unwavering obligation to be a person in whom your client can trust and depend on, to seek their best interests, along with helping them with growth and development. The preamble goes on to outline not only our core professional values, but it really focuses in on some fundamental principles of our professional behavior. So those principles became the spotlight of how I broke these down and what our relationship should look like when counseling individuals with disabilities. And then I listed out some very specific clinical implications that we could put into practice to make sure that we're practicing ethically. The first fundamental, we're going to look at autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. The first one we're going to look at is autonomy. Now, autonomy is fostering the right to control the direction of one's life. As autonomy relates to self-governance or personal control, What it really means is just a person's independence. And we all enjoy our independence and love our independence, so it's important for us to help our clients maintain their independence. According to Perry, Beyer, and Holm, 2009, one of the most challenging ethical issues in the case of individuals, especially those with intellectual disabilities, is that of consent. And so this relates directly to moral principle of respect, and also respectful treatment in disclosing information, probing for and ensuring understanding and voluntariness from our clients, and fostering independent decision making. The issue of competence is obviously something that comes up when you're talking about the independence or the right to control one's life. Competence comes up. And in 2007, I know we touched on it earlier in the video as well. In 2007, the Mental Capacity Act was passed, and the following principles were listed out in relationship to a person's competence. So a person must be assumed to have capacity unless it has been established that they lack capacity. A person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision unless all practicable steps to help them do so has been taken without success. A person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision because they make merely because they make an unwise decision. And so let's just touch on these for a moment. So we've all made unwise decisions. Depending on how old you are, you could have made multiple unwise decisions, or you could have made one or two unwise decisions. And so we have to stop and think, how would we feel if someone took away our independence or our right to make decisions about our life because we've made an unwise choice? So it's very important not to treat someone as if they are incompetent merely because they've made an unwise decision. Also, we cannot treat them as being unable to make a decision unless all practicable steps to help them do so have been taken without success. So that is not to say that we will not have to help with accommodations. That's not to say that we may not have to employ different means of understanding, but we can't rule someone incapable of making decisions about their own life unless we've done everything that we can to help them secure their independence and keep their independence. When it comes to giving consent, especially with individuals with disabilities, well, with anyone for that matter, consent should always be voluntary and never come under undue influence. So professionals, doctors, family members, counselors, friends, no one should coerce an individual into giving consent. It should always be of their own choice to do so. Perry, Beyer, and Holm also noted that a second ethical challenge to counseling individuals with disabilities is in relationship to response bias. And this is very important to recognize when it comes to autonomy. So individuals with disabilities, especially those with learning disabilities, can have great difficulty responding to questions, especially those concerning abstract matters. And so they're more prone to give a general answer, or they may have a tendency to just respond in a positive manner, regardless of what the question is being asked. You could ask them, if they're in a really bad mood, and they're going to respond in a positive manner. I don't know that that was the best example, but they just have a tendency, no matter what the situation is, to respond positively. Another defense mechanism or response mechanism they can employ is to select the last response given. So for example, if you ask someone, do you want coffee or tea? They're going to choose tea because tea was the last choice given. You can turn around 30 seconds later and ask them again, but rephrase your question and say, do you want tea or coffee? And they may tell you coffee because they're just giving you the last response option that you gave them. So it is extremely important for counselors not to take things at face value. We have an understanding to ensure we have an obligation to ensure that they have an understanding of what is being asked and what is being said, even if that means we need to rephrase our questions, rephrase our statements, simplify what we're explaining, or simplify the questions that we're asking. We make modifications to support their independence. So when you remember that autonomy is the right that an individual has to control their own life, other clinical implications that we need to put into practice to support this and to address ethical challenge is employing the necessary modifications to enhance communication. That's what we were just talking about, what we just touched on. Simplifying the questions, rephrasing our statements, and address the client directly rather than conversation with an accompanying adult. How easy is it to, if a family member accompanies an individual that has an intellectual disability with them, how easy is it to unintentionally begin to have a conversation with that family member rather than addressing the individual you're counseling? So it's very important to always address them directly and to support their independence and autonomy. Identify environmental changes or accommodations that may be needed. Assist the family and assist the client with planning and the necessary steps to implement those. Whatever is needed to help those clients with disabilities have as much independence and autonomy as necessary. Help family members reframe the problem and focus on the client's strengths. So many times it's easy to focus on the negative. It's easy to focus on what they can't do or what can't be accomplished. So turn it around and focus on and reinforce the positive attributes of the client, of the family member, their strengths, what they can accomplish on their own. And help both the client and the family member develop self-advocacy skills. This is so extremely important, especially in situations where they may not have the capacity to advocate for themselves. And realize, this goes along with that, realize that the mental health professional may have to step in and serve as an advocate or a consultant to initiate changes. In the academic or work setting, if they're having a hard time getting the modifications or changes initiated that they need to be independent, to serve themselves better, then the mental health professional may have to step in and kind of advocate and initiate that change. And that's our responsibility. The next thing we're going to talk about, the next fundamental principle, is non-maleficence. So non-maleficence is the counselor's responsibility to avoid actions that cause harm. This principle right here is so important that the Code of Ethics not only lists it in the preamble under our core ethical principles, client welfare and avoiding harm is addressed in some form in almost every section of the ACA Code of Ethics. Now, obviously, I don't have time and I won't go into every single section and every single code listed, but here's just a few examples that address non-maleficence specifically that I wanted to point out. Section A1, we have a primary responsibility to promote client welfare. Section A4A, counselors act to avoid harming their clients, trainees, and research participants. And this section right here goes even further to address our obligation to minimize or remedy unavoidable or unanticipated harm. So what this means is we should always be aware of any potential harm that may come to our clients. And that means that we have to be the eyes and the ears and always pay attention to what they're telling us, what their family members are telling us, what their caregivers are telling us. We have to be their eyes and ears and be on the lookout for anything that may cause potential harm, because we have an ethical obligation to step in and prevent that harm if we see it coming. And this is extremely important in counseling this group of individuals. Section B5 addresses individuals with disabilities specifically. So when clients who lack the capacity to give voluntary or informed consent, like we were talking about earlier, counselors are obligated to protect the confidentiality of the information received and do whatever we can to work in their best interest. Section E5A. Counselors take special care to provide proper diagnosis of mental disorders. So this is, I know I keep saying that each thing is extremely important, but it really is, because this group of individuals is especially susceptible to misdiagnosis. It's easy to assume that one knows what's going on when they come in to see us, but to assume and misdiagnose would cause harm, and we have an ethical obligation to cause no harm. Sue, Neville, and Smith, 2019, suggested some other ways that we can fulfill our ethical obligation and practice in an ethical manner are identify our beliefs, assumptions, and attitudes about individuals with disabilities. This is something we've been practicing all semester long with every group that we've discussed or learned about. Do you have myths about individuals? Are there myths that you believe about individuals with disabilities? Do you have preconceived notions that might affect your ability to counsel them or avoid causing harm to them? Are there ideas that you have that you need to reframe and really dig into? So identifying your own beliefs and assumptions will allow you to educate yourself and make sure you have accurate information and work to your very best ability to protect the welfare of your client. Another thing we can do, work to understand the prejudice, discrimination, inconveniences, and barriers that they face, with the individuals face with physical disabilities and problems that are faced by individuals with invisible disabilities. Another important area to help clients in is redirecting internalized self-blame for the disability to societal attitudes. So a lot of times they can blame themselves for being disabled. And it's very important to redirect that internalized self-blame into a healthy manner, to help them learn to view themselves in a healthy aspect. And then in regards to the diagnosis that we've mentioned, we should determine whether the disability they have is related to the presenting problem that they've come to see us about. If it does relate to the presenting problem, then we need to identify whether the client adheres to an identity model, one of the identity models we discussed earlier in the presentation, and then determine whether that disability will influence the assessment or treatment strategies. Because if you allow it to influence assessment and treatment strategies when it should have no influence, then you have practiced in an unethical manner. So it's so important to keep that separate. It's been long recognized that individuals with disabilities can be stigmatized, and to counter this, counselors must protect their clients and emphasize the importance of being respected as individuals. So let's look now at beneficence. Beneficence is to work for the good of the individual and society by promoting mental health and well-being. Cornish, Gorgons, and Monsoon, 2009, explained that persons with disabilities are a large and growing minority group in the United States. And that research was done in 2009, so here we are in 2020, and I'm sure that number is even greater. Then they were a large and growing minority group, second only to combined ethnic groups. So most people with disabilities have a membership in other underrepresented groups. And so in addition to their disabilities, these individuals may also share some common experiences with oppression and discrimination, and these experiences will unite them in sharing common values, customs, and concerns within their disability group. And what I mean by that, for example, like the deaf community. The deaf community works together to advocate for inclusion of deafness in conceptions of multiculturalism. So in order to promote mental health and well-being for the individual and the society, we must be aware of multicultural issues that affect the specific disabilities. And so a lack of awareness in any of these areas can leave a client with a disability feeling even further marginalized or further invalidated. And so it's important not to marginalize them or invalidate them further than they already feel. So in order to practice ethically, Susu, Neville, and Smith gave us some implications here for clinical practice. And so we must assess the impact of multiple sources of discrimination on ethnic minorities and other diverse populations with disabilities. So we have to look at every area that they're being affected by. And we also have to recognize that family members and social support are important. They're very important, and when possible, they should be included. But we have to practice discretion here because there's a balance between autonomy and beneficence. And so obviously some individuals with disabilities, they need help, and their family members and their social support is a very strong in their lives. And so we should include them in every extent possible, every way that we can. But we have to be careful not to violate their autonomy. Like I was talking earlier, like don't use family members as interpreters for don't, especially with those with communication difficulties. Always promote the independence of the client. And it's important to remember that family members, even though they try to be a strong support, and even though they're always there for their loved ones, because they're not experiencing the disability themselves, sometimes they don't fully understand the disability. And when they don't fully understand the disability, unintentionally, they could be part of the problem. So it's very important to just stay aware of that and all of the factors that influence what the client is going through. The next thing we're going to look at is justice. Justice, justice, justice. Justice is the ethical practice of treating individuals equitably. I'm sorry, I cannot talk this afternoon. Treating individuals equitably and fostering fairness and equality. So it goes without saying that this has been a challenge for individuals with disabilities. We talked about it earlier. We've talked about the American with Disabilities Act that came into effect in 1990, and then all the way back to 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was put into legislation in 1973. And so both of these were milestones, but if you think about that, all the way back in 1973, this act had to be put in place and it was the first federal law that specifically addressed the fact that no otherwise qualified disabled individual in the United States shall solely because of their disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program. The purpose of this law of the American Disabilities Act was to ensure people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. And as counselors, our fundamental ethical practice should always be to protect the justice or equitable treatment of individuals with disabilities. And some of the ways that we can do this work directly in correlation with autonomy, because it's about helping the client and the family members develop self-advocacy skills. And they have to have those skills so that they can advocate for themselves for fair and equal treatment. And helping the family members and the clients focus on the strengths to reinforce the positive attributes of the client. And then as mental health providers, we have to serve as advocates and consultants to help initiate change so that individuals with disabilities are being treated equally, that they're given the same opportunities as anyone else. So the last two principles, fundamental principles we're going to look at, we're not going to spend a lot of time here because both of these go without saying. Fidelity is to honor commitments and keep promises, including fulfilling one's responsibility of trust in professional relationships. This is further supported by the introduction of Section B in the ACA Code of Ethics. Counselors recognize that trust is the cornerstone of the counseling relationship, and they aspire to earn the trust of clients. Within a group like this that is so frequently exploited, abused, and marginalized, it is extremely important for us to do and be who we say we're going to be. This group depends on us to advocate for them. They depend on us to be the one person that they can trust and to always be in their corner for everything that they need. Veracity is the obligation we have to deal truthfully with individuals with whom counselors come into professional contact with. So within this group of individuals with disabilities, this correlates a lot with beneficence and justice. But as we advocate for our clients and we advocate against discrimination or exclusion, we may find ourselves in positions where we have to speak out on their behalf regarding improper diagnosis, regarding unfair treatment by other healthcare professionals, regarding unfair treatment by family members. Anytime there is an issue that arises, we can handle it in a professional manner, but we have an ethical obligation to step in and act in the best interest of our client and make sure that other professionals are treating them equitably, and we must deal with them truthfully. So as we kind of look at, what is our obligation also moving forward? Erickson, Cornish, Gorgans, and Monsoon 2008 recognized that the essential need to provide ethical treatment to persons with disabilities, minimizing barriers to care, and training future professionals in these endeavors was essential to what we were doing. So moving forward, the ways that we can do this is to attend disability awareness trainings, educate, seek professional consultation on pertinent issues, access relevant publications, locate appropriate referral sources. We will not be an expert on every issue that we may encounter, but we can be experts in making sure that we can refer our clients to the appropriate professionals who will build those trust cornerstones, deal with them ethically, and promote their best interests the same way that we would. So we can locate appropriate referral sources and then obviously obtain competent supervision for ourselves to make sure that we're always fulfilling our ethical obligation we have. We have, just like all of you, have learned so much during this presentation and the things that we've just researched and read about and learned about. And so it's just been insightful. There's no way to wrap up every single thing that we've learned without doing a completely different presentation, which I know y'all don't want right now. But it's important. Here's some key points that we talked about. It's important to be sensitive and accommodating to any disability our clients have. Whatever it is, we're to be supportive and, like I said, sensitive and accommodating. Historically, individuals have faced much discrimination and exploitation, and we have an obligation to stand in the gap and make sure that doesn't happen to the extent possible for us. Individuals with disabilities need to be able to trust us and depend on us to advocate for them. That just goes right along with making sure that they are not discriminated against or exploited. And then always presume competence on their part. Just because they're disabled does not mean they're incompetent. And so their autonomy, their independence should always be respected. And so we just thank you for listening. We hope that you've learned a lot from this presentation. We are recording it before Thanksgiving, but you will be watching it after Thanksgiving. So we hope that you've all had a socially distant holiday with your families and we're able to just reflect on all of the things that we have to be thankful for this year. And we just thank you for your attention.